In this video, I want to talk about what Christianity looks like after deconstruction. And I've kind of hesitated to make this video. I find these hard to make sometimes, just to be honest, because it's hard to put into words what I feel now and what I experience now. My spirituality is kind of messy, and I think that a lot of people look at the transition from, like, let's say a conservative type Christian to a liberal type Christian, using these labels kind of loosely. But I think a lot of people think that that just comes with like a belief swap, that you just change out one set of beliefs for a different one. And in reality, the transformation has actually been more like learning to speak a completely different language for faith. It's more like looking at the world in a way that you never thought to look at it before. So in doing this, I'm going to try my best to put some language to what I experience and what I think about this now. I know a lot of people are struggling with this and trying to figure out like how to express yourself. So I see a lot of comments about this. So hopefully in me doing this sort of imperfectly, it will help some people to kind of think through this too. And I'd love to know what you think about this. At any point, leave me some comments down below because I'm still learning how to talk about this. To begin with, I want to give a bit of a framework for how I think about faith now. And I'm going to use an imperfect scientific framework. Scientists will tell you that we do not have a unique type of personality based on whether we are right-brained or left-brained people. But nevertheless, it's often a metaphor we use to talk about the type of person you are. So if you are right-brained, that we say is a sign that you're creative, kind of free thinker. If you're left-brained, it's a sign that you like things a little more analytical, or you're a little more kind of like structuralist. And obviously, like I said, these are not scientific realities, but I think for the purposes of thinking this through, they can be kind of a helpful metaphor for thinking about faith. So I think that what happens is a lot of faith is dominated by what we would call left-brain thinking people. So these are people who, quite frankly, thrive in a world of doctrine, in a world of certainties, in a world of logic. And I think these type of people often feel very fundamentally psychologically safe with very in-the-box thinking. I think if we're being honest, even many of us who deconstructed used to think about faith in this way. I certainly did. This was why I was the best Christian when I was a fundamentalist Christian, because I really took the box seriously. I was like, this is basically where I live, and I can, be 100% sold out for God in this area, just following this nice rigid framework of the doctrines and who the good people are and who the bad people are, how to get to heaven, all that sort of thing. So I think that this type of left brain or dogmatic faith often dominates discussions of Christianity. And left brain faith is often, I think, a little more fear-based. It's often people who need a simple kind of certain world to operate in. It's not necessarily a bad thing all the time. I think that there's a certain type of psychological safety that comes with this type of left brain faith, this kind of certainty, and sometimes we need that. I know people who have gone through trauma or people who are in addiction. Left brain thinking gives them a way to feel safe and to feel certain in the world. That's psychological safety. And just as, this is going to sound a little harsh, but just as a belief in Santa Claus can be, I have to say this quietly because my kid's in the other room, just like a belief in Santa Claus can be a really valuable thing for kids. In the same way, I think that a doctrinal type of left brain faith, really strict faith, can, for certain types of people or at certain points in our lives, be a very valuable type of faith. And the connection here to youth, I think, is important too. I love Richard Rohr, and Richard Rohr has this book called Falling Upwards. It's a spirituality for what he calls the two halves of life. And here, he does something similar to what I'm talking about here, but instead of being left and right, he calls it basically the first half of life and the second half of life. And the first half of life, he says, is often dominated by this type of ego-driven, certain black and white type of thinking. And the second often isn't. I'll get to that in a minute. So I think that often religious systems are dominated by and built by left-brained people. And there are some good things to that. I think a lot of left-brained people are really good at systematizing things in a way that somebody... I'm a lot more right-brained in my way of living, so I'm a lot more creative. I'm a lot more stringing things together, as you can probably tell from me making this video. I'm a little less analytical and a little more free-thinking, free-spirity. So left-brained people can build religions, but the problem that often comes along when you let strictly left-brained thinking build your religion is that God ends up looking exactly like you. God often ends up looking exactly like this left-brained person or left-brained group of people. God hates the people they hate. He's scared of what they're scared of, especially people who think differently or are different. This God believes that men should dominate women. Surprise, surprise, matching our own prejudices. this God gives us a brain but tells us not to use it too hard because we already know the right answer, so we shouldn't think too much about it. Essentially, for these kinds of people, the structures that we operate in religiously are the God-given structure. Like, it's very difficult to push back against structures for these type of people because the structures make them feel safe, make them feel secure. And again, that psychological safety can have a place, but it often can turn into stale religion or hurtful religion. But anyway, often these kinds of left-brain people become like gatekeepers of belief. So what happens, I think, with deconstruction in many cases is that if we have been, using that left brain type of religious impulse to think doctrinally and rigidly and, be sure we have all the right answers and all that sort of thing, what tends to happen at deconstruction is often these types of left brain people will start getting holes poked in like that religious infrastructure, that religious system. They start to see flaws, like they start to see cracks in the foundation. They start to see the structure kind of falling apart. And a lot of people at this point just pull away, and they think the alternative to that kind of left brain religion is fundamentally no religion. And some of these people, incidentally, end up in a very similar looking left brain type of atheism, where you're just really certain about the world and you're very certain about who's wrong and who's right and what's wrong and what's right, and everyone's just on their path to become exactly like you. And this is kind of like the exact same thinking, but just like modeled in a different area. But I think for a lot of us, what happens is we have only ever known religion in that type of left brain type of space, that we think essentially, if you can't be certain about things, why bother? If you can't have a system that you can chase 100% and that, tells you who's right and who's wrong and all the good and bad and everything, why bother? Like, why bother having religion if it's not that type of left brain thinking? I think that we come by that pretty honestly, because I think that a lot of the history of Christianity has been dominated by exactly this type of left brain thinking. It's people who can build boxes. Right brain people will have these mystical experiences, these transformational moments. And then often left brain people or left brain thinking, maybe in the same person, will come along and tell us how to turn it into a structure, how to recreate it, how to always know exactly what that mystical experience meant, how to name it, how to own it, how to control it, maybe how to recreate it with exactly the right set of steps or set of doctrines. I don't even think there's anything inherently wrong with that. It's pretty much just a human impulse. It's normal in some way. And even the great sociologist Max Weber calls this a sort of religious tension between like extemporaneous, like spontaneous things happening and the need to structuralize things. So the kind of back and forth is a normal human impulse. But again, the left brain thinking often wins. You have the Apostle Paul having some kind of religious experience, and in his best words, trying to tell his communities exactly what that meant, and not always doing a great job, and struggling to explain it and build a communal identity around whatever he saw. And then in the 2nd, 3rd, 4th century, people come along and tell you exactly what that meant, exactly what you have to believe about it, and the right way to think about the Apostle Paul's visions or the teachings of Jesus or whatever. We systematize it into left brain type thinking. I think people who are prophets are often right brain people. They're often looking at systems and saying, this is broken. They're creative. They're thinking outside the box. If you read like the Hebrew prophets, you'll see this. They're speaking truth to power. They're breaking down the system. And then somebody comes along and uses the ideas of the prophets or uses that same faith to build new systems, to build new power structures or new empires. And I think that this type of left brain thinking will probably always have a place in faith. And I think that's okay. But I think we also desperately need that kind of right brain thinking. And I think we don't often tap into this enough. These are the creatives and the storytellers and the artists. And for me, coming back to me, the fact that I am a musician and a storyteller and creative has helped me rethink faith as not just switching out one sort of left brain set of doctrines for another sort of left brain set of doctrines, but for having a very sort of messy, like nonlinear way of thinking about faith now. Our faith desperately needs the creatives and the storytellers and the mystics and those people who are willing to see God or see the divine in places we don't expect or in ways we don't expect, and to see through the cracks in the sort of facades that are created by left brain thinking. So when I talk about coming back to faith, one of the foundational things for me was discovering Christian mysticism. And Christian mysticism, I don't really have a super good definition for it, but one that I've heard is that mysticism is the awareness of divine presence. And I sort of like that way of thinking about it, because really what happens with mysticism is, I would almost describe it for me, and this is just my experience with it, I would almost describe this as an openness. Mysticism, as I understand it, is an openness to looking around at the world and seeing it as potentially maybe porous, seeing reality as maybe imbued with meaning that we can't always understand, seeing the physical world as maybe having meaning that we can't understand, seeing the potential, if there is a divine, that the divine could, break through or be hidden in ways we don't always see and things we always can't understand. I know this can even sound a little bit flaky, but one of the things for me as left-brain people try to pin down God and try to pin down the divine and try to pin down exactly what all the right doctrines are and all the right thinking is. Right brain thinking comes back to this and says, this is messy. The systems that you built to contain God don't seem to contain God very well. So if there is a God, then God must be a little more messy than these really nice systems we have tried to put God in. And as a result, what happens is you experience a world that's full of divine possibility. There is the potential for the divine everywhere and maybe nowhere. You don't have to be rigid and see it uniquely in faith traditions. You can see the divine in all sorts of people and all sorts of places. And for me, that has been a really fantastic thing to stop thinking like, I know where God shows up. I know what God looks like. I know what type of things God does, because I think for most of this type of left brain faith, God is just a reflection of you. Essentially, God is just who you are, thinks how you think, and is as limited as you are by your understanding in the world. So mysticism creates an openness and I think a willingness to engage with the possibility of God. And I've been really honest and said often I'm agnostic. Some days I'm an atheist. So this is not like a certainty. The best word I know how to describe it as is an openness. It's an openness and a willingness to recognize that God could be out there somewhere, that the divine could be out there somewhere. I think the important thing to recognize about mystic Christianity is that the goal is not to eventually get to certainty, as far as I know. Maybe, I don't know, maybe I'll have some kind of magical experience. I think famously, Saint Thomas Aquinas apparently had an experience near the end of his life and said, like, everything I've done is total garbage. But aside from that happening, I don't really see certainty as the final end game here. I think it's just living a life with the type of openness I'm talking about. And one of the things people ask me if I pray, and I find it really hard to pray. I find that a lot of my language for prayer was so wrapped up in the type of fundamentalist thinking that I grew up around. I have like a visceral response sometimes now if I'm trying to say like praying type words. I find it really hard to do that. But what happens now, if I pray like a mystic, it feels a lot less like giving God a laundry list or asking God for a parking spot, or even just these sort of endless platitudes that talk about how big and wonderful and awesome God is, or maybe how terrible and small I am. It just feels more like meditation. It feels more of like an awareness, almost like a knowing that if God is, then everything is fine, and I'm fine, and I'm where I need to be, and I'm doing what I need to be doing. So that type of rooting in mysticism, as I understand it, has given me an ability to just engage with the spiritual wherever it is. But then what do I look for beyond that? I look for a tradition. I look for a specific type of language for this type of mystical experience. And for me, the tradition is Christianity. Christianity is my language for divine things. Christianity gives me a framework, essentially a faith tradition that lets me exercise all this. So it lets me act all this out in a specific faith tradition. And this comes with liturgy, for example. This comes with spiritual practices. It sometimes comes with a belief. Some beliefs kind of held loosely, but beliefs can even be a valuable way for thinking about God or the world or whatever. And fundamentally, that's what Christianity is for me. It's a socialized reality, because that mystical can't ever be put in a box. But nevertheless, sometimes our human experience, I think, needs to be ordered or structured according to that kind of left brain thinking. So for me, that is what the Christian tradition is. And I've said before, it's not because I see it as the only right tradition. It's not because I see it as the only way to God. I'm sorry to say, I see it as my sociological reality, as the framework for engaging with the other, for exploring ideas about a universe that could be bigger than me. And also, I say this a lot too, it's about connecting with who I am as a human and my ancestors who have long been in this tradition. And that as well gives me value. People often ask if I'm a cultural Christian, and I don't really like the word cultural Christian, but in that sense, in the sense that Christianity is my cultural expression of the divine, or my cultural language for understanding the mystical, to that extent, then yes, in that way, I'm a cultural Christian. By the way, I also think that all Christianity is cultural Christianity. So I made a video on that. You can watch it if you want. It's here. The other thing that a faith tradition gives us is community. And one of the things that I saw, even like a lot in the evangelical world, is people dropping out of faith communities and just watching videos on the internet of faith communities. And if you have a good reason for doing that, like you're bedridden or something, that makes a certain amount of sense. But I think for a lot of us, that's sacrificing one of the most important parts of church. A lot of people have come to see engagement with Christianity as being basically sort of like an a la carte menu that even, and this is true of evangelicals too, I'm going to get flack for this, not just liberals that do this, evangelicals do this too. Basically, it's about you and what you need and getting fed, if you've ever heard that way of talking about spirituality. And really, we need community. And this isn't even a strictly Christian thing. There are other ways to get community. You can get community at CrossFit, join a gym, go to, I don't know, Girl Guides, go to the library. There are other ways to get community. But church is a really good way to bring all of this mystical experience into a specifically kind of bounded community, and walking through this with other people, having these type of big conversations with other people, going through life together, supporting each other, hopefully loving each other. And that's why I still see a real value in going to church. So I do. Of course, somebody's going to come along, as they always do in the comments, and say, but what about Jesus? Because the whole point of Christianity is you have to think the right thing about Jesus. Now, often for the people in my comments, they think you need to believe that Jesus died as a sacrifice to appease God's wrath and was raised again, basically to signify God's forgiveness of your personal sins and therefore is your personal savior. Now, I think this is nonsense, but I've talked about that in other videos, so I won't talk about it right now. But here's why I think Jesus still matters in a couple ways. The one, even as somebody trained as a biblical scholar, I still find the character of Jesus compelling. And there's a complication here because there's only so much we can even know about the historical Jesus. So to some extent, we're just dealing also with a literary figure. But the idea of this figure who lives under the oppression of a Roman Empire and still teaches people that the main message to bring about God's kingdom is to love your neighbor and forgive each other and turn the other cheek. I find these really, in their own way, revolutionary preaching. Before I came to this more like liberal side of Christianity, I used to think, well, liberals just ignore like the true teachings of Christianity. And it's ironic because when I was in seminary surrounded by liberals, I was still kind of a conservative at this point. I realized they actually pay way more attention to the teachings of Jesus than I did. I was not really all that interested in the teachings of Jesus. And moreover, like talking about the teachings of Jesus was being like a social justice warrior or something. But here we do see it's really hard to escape in the New Testament. If this is our source for who Jesus was, and we actually care about who he was, then this is very much the sort of Jesus that we get. Now, the other thing that I find really compelling in the Christian message and the message about Jesus, and I think we don't often catch this, is that what Paul gives us is visions of somebody who's alive again after they were dead. I don't think we really appreciate that in the Jewish sects of Paul's time, there was an ongoing, active, basically battle over whether there even was a resurrection of the dead, over whether there even was, and specifically even whether there was life after death. I don't think we often catch how radical it is for the Apostle Paul as a Pharisee to say that he had, seen somebody alive after they were dead as, some kind of vision or whatever it was, whatever that experience looked like. That in itself is radical in a way that I don't think we always hear because we're not in that world. We just assume, well, there is life after death. And the main question is like, who gets to get it, right? Or what's going to happen? Is it going to be heaven or is it going to be hell? I think we miss that. And in that, I think there is another part of Christianity that for me and for humans has always been a really valuable part of it. And this is that it helps us to answer mortality. And I think like this is one of the most fundamental human questions. Is there life after death? In the Jesus message, there's fundamentally hope of life after death, that being in Christ in some way creates the possibility of being raised with Christ, of having life after death. And regardless, like this is a religious belief, this is, a metaphysical belief, but it is also a belief that has brought a lot of meaning and value to human beings and to Christians. And this is one of the other things I still find really compelling about Christianity and about the origins of Christianity. But coming full circle now to who I am as a trained biblical scholar, I think often people think that what I do as a biblical scholar is to rip things apart. And in a way, I guess if you are putting your trust in that type of right brain structure of Christianity that has very clearly been constructed by people, is very clearly a representation and reflection of the people that made it, then to an extent, I guess you could say like, yes, maybe sometimes scholarship tears that apart. I don't really find that scary. It doesn't really ever bother me. I think if we can know something, let's know it. Let's understand it. There's no fear of shattering the simplistic way that humans have created the divine in their own image. We can pull apart basically everything. I was doing something on the Trinity this week. My last video talked about it. And we can see the Trinity coming up in these sort of wars in the 2nd and 3rd century between different types of Christians, all of who thought they understood this important question about the nature of God, and they ended up excommunicating each other for it, in later centuries, killing people for the wrong beliefs. Like, looking at the history of that and realizing that it's problematic, to me, isn't a bother, because the goal of my faith, as I've already stated, is to experience a world that's filled with the possibility of God, to experience that in a faith tradition. And I'm really not that concerned about specific knowledge points or certain doctrines I have to believe. So I'm really interested in looking at all of the trickiest questions in early Christianity and coming to honest conclusions about them. And it doesn't bother me in the least to find out that, like, Jesus didn't say something we thought he said, for example, because this is almost always just shattering the mythology of how we build God in our own image. I think it's interesting that even in the 2nd and 3rd century, a lot of the church fathers understood this, because a lot of them pulled on this Greek philosophy, especially like the Platonic ideas of the forms, if you know, like the famous allegory of the cave, the idea of the world of the forms, that what we're understanding, what we're grasping, and early church thinkers said this, what we're grasping is never the thing itself. We're just trying to get at ways to understand something imperfectly in our human language, in our current time and place. So that's sort of a sketch of what Christianity looks like now to me. And coming back to Richard Rohr's way of thinking about this as being in the second half of life, he doesn't talk about it as being specifically like a dividing point in your middle of your life, that like you turn 30 or something and all of a sudden you have this wisdom and openness to spirituality. But he talks about moving into a time of life that isn't really driven by the ego in the same way. It's not driven by that certainty seeking or by this kind of fundamentalist desires. And of course, I know like there are 70-year-olds who are still being driven by ego and the need for certainty and the need for fundamentalism. So the second half of life is certainly not determined by like turning a certain age, but the second half of life is coming to a more adult spirituality, to embracing the mystery and coming back to what I'm describing as this type of right brain faith. So what happens when you do this? You end up losing from the left brain Christianity, you lose the certainty. You lose that psychological safety. And I think in a way, that's why a lot of people don't even want to do this. I think it's scary to actually be willing to lose something that's giving you psychological safety, even if it's not true. You lose clear answers. You lose tribalism. You lose the ability to think that your way of looking at the world is right and everyone else is wrong. But what you gain, in my experience, in my opinion, is actually far more valuable. You gain an ability to look at the world and find truth everywhere, and to recognize, as some people like to say, I like this, that all truth is God's truth. You can also engage with what I've called divine possibility outside of the box of your actual tradition. You can be open to the fact that God might live in all sorts of places that you didn't anticipate. I think that this type of right brain spirituality also gives you a certain openness and a certain humility and a certain patience that actually lets you really love people. Not like pretend to love people, not just try to be nice to people in hopes that they'll convert, which is sort of what we called love back when I was an evangelical fundamentalist, but an actual deep love for people, because you don't have anything you need them to do to love them. You can just love people the way they are. And I think that's a really been a really fantastic thing about my new way of looking at the world. And by the way, sticking with that humility, you don't always need to be right, which is also in itself just a beautiful like way to relax into life. That when I'm making these YouTube videos, I might be wrong sometimes. I probably am wrong sometimes. I don't need to fall back on the like, well, the Bible says and I need to be right about this. I can have the ability to recognize that in many cases I'm probably wrong. So to sum up, Christianity has always been flawed. It has always been imperfect. And I think so much of Christianity has been systematized and dominated and enforced by the type of left brain thinking that searches for certainty and dogma and boxes and truths that nobody else can have. But when you look at the Christian tradition, there have always been prophets. There have always been mystics. There have always been people who saw truth beyond what everyone else could see. Sometimes they were killed for it. Sometimes they saw the divine in places where we didn't necessarily expect to see the divine. And sometimes those people were punished for it too. But this is the long strain within Christianity that I want to be associated with: the creatives, the free thinkers, the open people who are willing to recognize that we don't need to keep God in a box, because the world is a lot more interesting when we're open to the possibility of God being everywhere. So at the end of this, I really can't give you a doctrinal checklist. And I'm not doing this to be a flaky liberal. I'm not just resisting this because, I don't want to stand for truth or something. The problem is I want to be honest. And when I talk honestly about faith, when I talk honestly about like what I've been through and how I see the world now, this is honestly the way I see the world now. And it lets me embrace the possibility of metaphysical. It lets me still be a Christian and enjoy that tradition. And it also still lets me, by the way, engage in deep biblical scholarship, asking honest, hard questions and going wherever that evidence leads me. And even as somebody trained as a biblical scholar, when I approach the Bible with this kind of like openness, but also scholarly rigor, I see things that the world of fundamentalism would have never let me see. And that's why I think I love it more than ever before. I hope this was interesting to you. As always, it was really imperfect. And if you'd like to add your thoughts or your ways of seeing the world to the comments below, I'd love to read those and see like how you've come to understand yourself in a Christian tradition. You don't have to agree with me. You don't have to think the same way I do about this. Take a second, leave a comment below. Let me know what you think. Thank you so much for taking the time to watch this. I'll see you next time.